Hello, and welcome to Creepy Raindrops. Before you drift off to sleep, let me tell you a story. A story that will help you relax and fall into a deep, peaceful slumber. Sit or lie down comfortably, and let the world around you slowly fade away. Tonight, I will take you on a journey through the woods, where the air is cool and the shadows of the trees stretch long. As you listen, let your mind relax, your body feel heavy, and all the noise in your head gradually fade away. Before we begin, I'd like to know, which city are you listening to this story from? And what time is it there? Night of Terror, when a snowstorm unveils horrors in the northern woods. It was December 23, 1982, in the remote town of Maple Ridge, situated deep in the forests of northern Maine. The small community, with its rows of wooden cabins, had always been quiet, even eerie at times. Known for its isolation and harsh winters, Maple Ridge was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Yet no one truly ventured beyond the town's outskirts, especially when the snowstorms arrived. The storm that night, however, would be unlike any the residents had ever seen. Evelyn Foster, a 32-year-old local teacher, had just finished her shift at the school and was making her way home. The temperature had already dropped to below freezing, and the snow was beginning to fall heavily. Thick, swirling gusts of wind pushed the snow against the windows of her car as she drove down the winding, snow-covered road leading to her cabin. The radio crackled with a warning about the storm intensifying, urging everyone to stay indoors. At 9:45 p.m., as the wind howled through the treetops, Evelyn's car slid off the icy road, coming to a halt just feet from a snowbank. Her heart raced as she grasped the steering wheel, trying to calm herself. She had driven this route countless times, yet tonight felt different. The storm had transformed the world outside into a blurred, suffocating white abyss. The headlights flickered, casting strange, elongated shadows against the snow-covered trees. Evelyn decided it was best to leave the car and walk home. The wind stung her face as she stepped outside, and she quickly bundled up in her thick woolen scarf and coat. The wind seemed to carry an unnatural chill, biting at her skin like something alive, something that wasn't entirely weather. As she trudged along the path, the snow began to fall harder, swallowing up the world around her in an eerie silence. She had just reached the edge of the woods, a place she usually avoided at night, when she heard it, a low, guttural growl. It was barely audible over the wind, but Evelyn froze, her breath hitching in her chest. Her eyes darted around, but the trees were still, the shadows deep. Her pulse quickened. The growl came again, this time closer. It wasn't an animal. It was something far darker, more sinister. Her heart pounding, Evelyn turned to run back to her car, but a flash of movement in the snow caught her eye. A figure, tall, shadowed, draped in darkness, standing in the middle of the path ahead. It didn't move, didn't speak. The only sound was the wind and the steady crunch of snow beneath her boots. For a moment, she stood paralyzed, torn between flight and the sinking feeling that she should somehow approach this figure. Slowly, the figure lifted its head, and Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. A face, pale, gaunt, and eerily familiar. It was the face of a man who had gone missing from Maple Ridge years ago. His name was Jack Turner, a logger who had disappeared without a trace in 1977. Local rumors had claimed he'd met a grisly end in the woods, but no one had ever found his body. The figure didn't speak. Instead, it tilted its head, as if acknowledging Evelyn's presence, and then, slowly, began to walk toward her. With a surge of adrenaline, Evelyn spun around and ran, the sound of crunching footsteps echoing behind her, growing louder with each passing second. As she darted through the trees, the wind intensified, the snow blurring her vision, making it harder to navigate. Her thoughts raced. Jack Turner couldn't be here. He was dead. But the figure, the chilling, hollow-eyed stare, it had been him. Evelyn stumbled through the snow, gasping for breath, and finally spotted the faint lights of her cabin in the distance. She pushed her body harder, heart pounding, praying that whatever was chasing her wouldn't reach her in time. Just as she was about to cross the threshold of her home, she felt a cold hand grab her shoulder. Spinning around, she came face to face with the figure once more. But this time, its eyes, deep, empty, black, stared into hers. And that's when the whispering began. The voice was like the wind, cold and raspy, yet filled with a sense of urgency. Words she couldn't understand, but the terror it instilled in her was undeniable. The hand on her shoulder tightened, and she could feel her body freezing, not just from the cold, but from something else, something far more terrifying. What had happened to Jack Turner? And what had he become? The wind howled with a ferocity that made the walls of Evelyn's cabin creak, as though they too were afraid of the storm outside. She stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest, her breath shallow and rapid. The figure before her, Jack Turner, loomed like a shadow, unmoving except for the slight rise and fall of its chest. She could feel the icy grip of its hand tightening on her shoulder, and a cold, unnatural dread filled her veins. There was no denying it anymore. Something had happened in the woods that night. Something was not right. Evelyn could barely comprehend the images flooding her mind. The unspoken knowledge that Jack Turner, the missing logger, was not truly gone. She had heard the stories, the whispers that drifted through the townspeople's conversations. How Jack had been swallowed up by the forest, lost in a freak accident or a wild animal attack. But the way the figure before her moved, the haunting absence in its eyes, told a different tale. Something had brought him back. Something dark. Something twisted. Her mind raced, trying to find an escape. But her body was rooted to the spot, as if the snow itself had crept into her bones, rendering her immobile. She wanted to scream, to run, but the whispering voice in the wind intensified, drawing closer like an unrelenting force. It felt as though the very air around her had thickened, closing in on her, filling her lungs with icy pressure. The whispering was soft at first, like a distant murmur. Then it grew louder, more urgent, as though it were coming from all directions. Evelyn could not understand the words, but they seemed to make her head spin, drowning out her thoughts. It was as though something ancient, something primal, was trying to communicate with her through the cold, through the storm. The air around her became dense with the scent of decay, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up in response. She took a trembling step backward, her eyes darting around the clearing. The light from her cabin seemed so far away now, swallowed up by the snowstorm that raged around her. The woods had turned into a labyrinth of shadows, each one seeming to stretch and curl like tendrils, waiting to ensnare her. "Jack?" she whispered, the name escaping her lips as if it were the only thing her frozen brain could focus on. The figure did not answer, but the whispering ceased, replaced by a low, guttural growl that rumbled from deep within the earth. It wasn't the growl of a bear or any known creature of the forest. It was something older, something unnatural. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the last, drowning out everything except the sound of her own panic. With a surge of adrenaline, Evelyn yanked herself free from the grip of the shadowy figure. She stumbled back, almost falling to the ground in her desperation to escape. Her breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air searing her lungs, but she didn't stop. She turned and bolted toward her cabin, her feet slipping in the thick snow. Her mind was a blur of terror. The image of Jack Turner, no, whatever he had become, burned into her mind. As she neared the cabin, the figure, Jack, began to move again, his pace quickening. His footsteps, heavy and deliberate, followed her like the pounding of a drum. Each step brought him closer, and Evelyn's legs felt like lead. She had to reach the cabin, had to find a way inside before it was too late. When she reached the door, her hands were shaking so violently that she could barely turn the knob. She shoved the door open and slammed it behind her with all her strength. Her eyes flew to the window, where the storm raged, the snow swirling in chaotic patterns. But she saw nothing. No sign of the figure. No shadow. The woods were silent once more, as though nothing had happened. Evelyn staggered to the couch and collapsed, clutching her chest as she gasped for air. Her mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. Was she imagining things? Had the storm simply played tricks on her? But no. The memory of those cold, hollow eyes, the unmistakable presence of the figure, was too vivid, too real to ignore. Something was out there. Something that had not just returned from the past, but had been unleashed by the storm. The darkness of the woods had claimed it, and now it was coming for her. Minutes passed in a fevered silence, the only sound the howl of the wind and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. Evelyn could not shake the feeling that she was being watched, that she was not alone. Her mind went back to the stories she had heard growing up. Everyone in Maple Ridge knew of the strange happenings in the woods. Disappearances, strange lights, strange sounds that seemed to come from the trees. But it was always brushed off as superstition, old folklore meant to frighten children and keep them from wandering too far. But now Evelyn wasn't so sure. The storm continued to rage outside, but Evelyn couldn't stay inside any longer. She needed answers. She needed to know what was happening, why Jack Turner was back, and what he wanted. She grabbed her coat, threw it on over her pajamas, and made her way to the back door. Before stepping out into the cold again, she paused, her hand resting on the doorframe. Her eyes flicked to the small kitchen, where a knife sat on the counter, gleaming in the dim light. She grabbed it, the weight of it comforting in her hand. Then, she opened the door and stepped outside once more, the wind instantly assaulting her face. The woods were just as oppressive as before, but this time Evelyn felt a strange pull to go deeper, as though the forest was calling to her. She turned in the direction where she had seen Jack, or whatever he was, and began walking, each step heavy with dread. The snow crept higher around her boots, the trees loomed taller, and the whispering wind seemed to follow her, curling around her ears like 1,000 hushed voices. As she ventured deeper into the woods, the storm grew worse, the snow falling in blinding sheets, but Evelyn's resolve hardened. She had to find out what had happened to Jack. She had to know why he had returned. The path ahead was barely visible, but Evelyn kept moving, driven by a force she couldn't name. And then, through the swirling snow, she saw it. Something different. A faint glow. It was coming from deep within the woods, far from the town, far from the safety of the cabin. The light flickered like a candle, and Evelyn's heart quickened. She followed it, every instinct telling her to turn back, but her feet carried her forward, deeper into the heart of the forest. The glow grew brighter, and as she reached it, she stumbled upon something she could never have prepared for. In the center of a clearing, surrounded by twisted, blackened trees, was a small, eerie bonfire. The flames danced in the wind, casting strange, flickering shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. And standing around the fire were figures, dozens of them, pale and gaunt, their eyes empty, their faces twisted in a way that was both human and not. Evelyn's blood ran cold as she realized that she was not alone. Jack Turner was there, standing among them, but now his face was no longer the gaunt, familiar face of the man she had once known. It was something otherworldly, a face that seemed to shift and change with the flickering firelight, its features constantly morphing into something grotesque. And he was not alone. The group turned to her, their hollow eyes fixated on her with an intensity that sent waves of terror through her body. They didn't move, not yet, but she could feel the weight of their gaze, the hunger in the air. The fire crackled, and the wind howled louder than before, but all she could hear now was her own heartbeat, pounding in her ears. Evelyn's hands gripped the knife tighter, her knuckles white. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, to pulse with a life of its own. The air grew thick with a suffocating presence, and for the first time she realized there was no escaping this. The forest was alive, and it had been waiting for her. Evelyn stood in the heart of the darkened forest, her breath clouding the air as she took in the surreal sight before her. The clearing, with its flickering bonfire and the pale, gaunt figures standing around it, was a scene from a nightmare. The wind howled louder, swirling in chaotic patterns as the snow fell in sheets, enveloping the figures like ghosts drifting through the storm. Jack Turner, or what had become of him, was among them, his form shifting in the flickering shadows. The figures, all standing eerily still, seemed to be waiting for something, waiting for her. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, each beat vibrating through her whole body. Her hand tightened around the knife, the cold metal offering little comfort against the overwhelming sense of dread that gripped her. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to turn around and flee back to the safety of her cabin. But something held her in place. The figure of Jack, if it could still be called Jack, slowly turned his head to meet her gaze. His eyes, once the familiar brown of a man she had known, were now empty, black voids that reflected no light, no warmth. There was nothing human left in them. It was as though he were merely an empty shell, an entity that had been taken over by something far darker, something ancient and malevolent. His lips parted, and for a brief moment, Evelyn thought he was going to speak, but instead, a low, guttural sound escaped him. A sound that wasn't a word, but more of a growl, a vibration that seemed to resonate with the very earth beneath her feet. The figures around him shifted slightly, their eyes never leaving her. Their movements so subtle they could have been part of the wind, part of the snowstorm itself. A strange, cold sensation washed over Evelyn. She felt a weight pressing on her chest, as though the very atmosphere was thickening, suffocating her with an unseen force. The air was no longer just cold. It felt alive, like it was breathing, like it was waiting for something to happen. Her body was tense, each muscle coiled in preparation for the unknown. She took a step back, and to her horror, the ground beneath her shifted with a faint tremor, as if the earth itself was acknowledging her presence. The wind picked up again, but this time it was different. The snowstorm seemed to follow the rhythm of the wind, spiraling around the clearing in a tornado-like vortex. The figures remained unmoving, but their gaze on her intensified, growing more focused, more predatory. Evelyn's mind raced. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the air, and she could see the twisted faces of the figures more clearly now. They were not human. There was something wrong about them. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, their bodies unnaturally thin, their limbs elongated in ways that seemed impossible. And their eyes, those black, hollow eyes, were the same as Jack's, vacant and endless, as though their souls had been swallowed whole by the forest, leaving only empty shells behind. The growling sound from Jack grew louder, vibrating in her chest, and then, in a voice that seemed to come from deep within the earth, he spoke. "Welcome home," he whispered, though the words seemed to echo from all directions. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The words, though soft, were laden with an undeniable menace. It felt as though the very forest itself had been waiting for her, as if her arrival had been foreordained, as if the storm, the whispers, the chilling presence that had been following her from the moment she left her cabin, had all been building to this moment. Why? She managed to croak, the question coming from somewhere deep within her. She wasn't sure what she was asking. Why Jack had returned, why these figures were here, or why the storm had become so unbearable. But in that moment, she understood that the answers might not matter. Whatever this force was, it had been waiting for her. Jack tilted his head, and for a brief moment, something familiar flickered in his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by that empty, abyssal stare. "You are the key," he murmured, the words barely audible over the howling wind. The ground beneath Evelyn's feet trembled once more, and her mind spun, trying to grasp the meaning of his cryptic words. The key to what? The storm? The forest? The forest that seemed to pulse and breathe with a life of its own? Her body was frozen in place, her mind unable to move forward or backward. Every instinct told her to flee, but she couldn't move. She felt trapped in the grip of something beyond her understanding, something ancient and powerful. Another figure, a woman this time, stepped forward from the circle of shadows around the fire. Her eyes were the same black voids as the others, but there was something different about her. She seemed taller, more imposing, her long, twisted limbs moving with an unnatural fluidity. "You've always known," the woman said, her voice carrying a cold certainty. "This place, this forest, it's not just a place. It's a prison, and you've been chosen to open the door." Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine as the woman spoke. Chosen? Prison? What were they talking about? Her mind raced to piece together the fragments of stories she had heard over the years. The strange disappearances, the eerie happenings in the woods, the warnings of the elders who spoke in hushed tones. But none of it made sense. How could she be the key? How could she open a door? Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to make sense of what was happening. But the words the woman had spoken clung to her like an insidious fog. Evelyn's eyes darted to the fire, and she felt its heat reach her skin, though it was a false warmth, something far more dangerous. The flames didn't flicker naturally. They writhed, twisted, as though they were alive, feeding on something unseen. Suddenly, a realization hit her with the force of a lightning bolt. The fire wasn't just a fire, it was a portal, a gateway. And she was the one who was supposed to open it. Her hands shook violently, and the knife in her grip seemed to grow heavier. The storm outside raged louder, and the forest around her seemed to close in, the trees bending toward her as though they too were waiting for the door to open. "What is behind the door?" she asked, her voice trembling, barely audible above the wind. The woman's lips curled into a cruel smile, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "The ancient ones, the ones who slumber beneath the earth, the ones who were forgotten, but they are not gone. They never left." Evelyn's mind reeled. The ancient ones? Forgotten gods? Spirits trapped beneath the earth? The pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place, but the more she understood, the more the terror clawed at her chest. The figures around the fire began to move, slowly, methodically. They began to chant, their voices blending with the howling wind, rising in a low, rhythmic hum. The ground shook again, and Evelyn could feel the vibrations reverberating through her bones, through her very soul. The forest seemed alive, the trees whispering, the earth shifting beneath her feet. Jack stepped forward, his black eyes fixed on her. "You have to open it," he repeated, his voice not quite his own. "You have to unlock what lies beneath." Before Evelyn could respond, the fire suddenly flared, its flames growing higher, swallowing the figures in the inferno's light. The wind picked up, spiraling faster, faster, until the snowstorm seemed to blur the world around her. She could no longer see the faces of the figures clearly, just their shifting shapes moving within the flames. The chanting grew louder, more frantic, and Evelyn felt a sudden urge, a pull toward the fire. It was as though the very ground beneath her feet was urging her to step forward, to walk into the flames, to open the door. Evelyn fought the urge, shaking her head violently. No, she couldn't do it. She didn't understand what was at the other side of the fire, but she knew it wasn't something she could control. It wasn't something she could handle. But the pull was growing stronger, and with each passing second, it felt as if the forest itself was drawing her in, forcing her hand to unlock whatever it was that lay beyond. The figures began to move again, this time closing in on her, their black eyes trained on her, their chanting escalating into an overwhelming, terrifying crescendo. The storm seemed to envelop them all, and the fire exploded in a burst of light, sending waves of heat rushing toward Evelyn. It was now or never. Evelyn's hand trembled as it reached for the knife, the cold metal of the blade feeling like a lifeline in her grip. She didn't know if it would work, if it would stop the darkness that was closing in around her, but it was the only choice she had. As she stepped forward, the wind shrieked, and the world seemed to warp around her, the trees bending under the weight of an ancient force. Then, with a single motion, Evelyn plunged the knife into the heart of the fire, and everything went black. As Evelyn's hand plunged the knife into the center of the fire, the world seemed to stop. Time froze, the wind stilled, and the snow ceased falling for a brief, terrible moment. She felt a searing pain shoot up her arm, the blade of the knife sinking deeper into the flames. But it wasn't the fire that hurt. It was the feeling that she was touching something far more ancient, more powerful than anything she could comprehend. Her mind screamed in protest, her instincts clawing at her to pull away, but her hand remained fixed. The moment the blade made contact, the air itself seemed to tremble. The fire roared louder, its flames suddenly twisting and curling like serpents, reaching toward her, licking at her face, her skin, but they didn't burn. It wasn't fire anymore, not in the way she understood it. It was alive, a sentient, seething entity that seemed to react to her presence. The heat wasn't unbearable. It was suffocating, an invisible force pushing in from every direction. Her lungs felt as if they were filling with molten steel, and yet she could breathe. The trees around her creaked, their limbs shaking violently as if the forest itself was in the throes of some unimaginable agony. The figures that had surrounded the fire, Jack and the others, seemed to blur and distort, their faces becoming more monstrous, their bodies elongating and warping, twisting into forms that no longer resembled human beings. Their eyes, black, hollow voids, flashed with an intensity that bordered on madness. They were no longer waiting. They were watching, waiting for something that was beyond Evelyn's understanding. Their chanting rose to a deafening crescendo, a sound that seemed to tear at her mind, reverberating through her skull like 1,000 voices screaming in unison. Then, suddenly, the flames pulsed. The world around Evelyn flickered, as though reality itself was being distorted, bent out of shape. She was no longer in the forest. She was standing in the middle of a vast, dark expanse, a place that felt like it was beneath the earth, beyond the veil of time itself. The air was thick with an unnatural fog, cold and damp, clinging to her skin, making it impossible to breathe freely. The ground beneath her feet felt wrong, as though it was alive, shifting with an energy she couldn't quite grasp. The figures, those twisted, unrecognizable forms, stood at the edge of the darkness, their eyes gleaming in the suffocating gloom. Their bodies were no longer just elongated, but contorted into grotesque shapes, their limbs stretching unnaturally. They were silent now, their presence more oppressive than ever. Jack, or whatever had once been Jack, was at the front of the group, his mouth twisted into a silent scream that seemed to echo throughout the void. The whispering began again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just a sound. It was a sensation, a weight on her chest, a presence that seemed to crawl beneath her skin. The whispering wasn't from the figures, but from somewhere far deeper, from the heart of this place, from the depths of the earth itself. "You opened the door," the voice murmured, not in words, but in thoughts, in a language older than time. It was inside her mind, scraping against her consciousness like 100 sharp nails. Evelyn's breath hitched, her pulse quickening as she stumbled backward, feeling the oppressive weight of whatever was behind her, closing in. Her body ached as though it were being pulled in every direction, but the voice continued. "You have unlocked what was bound long ago," it whispered, "and now it is awake. Now it is free." The figures, once silent, began to move again, their bodies shuddering as though they were breaking free from some ancient restraint. Jack's form swelled and shrank, his face no longer resembling a man but a creature of nightmare, a grotesque amalgamation of flesh and shadow. The others, too, twisted into shapes that defied all logic, their forms expanding into impossible proportions, their eyes gleaming with the hollow hunger of something that had been starved for centuries. The ground beneath Evelyn trembled, and the air thickened as if the very atmosphere had become charged with an unbearable energy. The flames that had once engulfed the fire now poured from the edges of the clearing, rippling like liquid fire, crawling across the ground toward her. The fire no longer seemed like a natural element. It was alive, a manifestation of something darker, something ancient that was eager to consume all in its path. Evelyn stumbled back, her legs unsteady, her heart pounding. She was trapped, surrounded by these things, by this waking nightmare. She could feel the pull of the fire, its heat intensifying as it encroached on her space, but something deep within her fought against it. She didn't know where this strength was coming from, but it felt like a spark, a tiny flame within her that resisted the growing darkness. The voices in her head grew louder, converging into a cacophony of whispers, each one fighting to break free, to take control of her mind. The figures that once stood at the edges of the clearing now closed in, their movements slow but deliberate, their eyes fixed on her with an intensity that felt like it was stripping her of her soul. Evelyn felt the weight of their gaze, the crushing sense of inevitability that loomed over her. She had been chosen for this moment, had unknowingly opened the door to something that had been locked away for millennia. And now there was no turning back. The forces that had been unleashed could not be contained. But amidst the overwhelming fear, Evelyn felt something else, something she hadn't expected. A flicker of clarity, a voice, not the dark whisperings of the ancient ones, but her own voice, calling out from deep within her. She understood in that instant what she had to do. She raised the knife, her grip tightening around the handle, and despite the storm of darkness swirling around her, she felt a surge of strength. The fire that had once seemed like an unstoppable force was now just a doorway that she could close, if only she could gather the strength to do so. The ground beneath her feet cracked as she took a step forward, and with a cry that came from the very depths of her soul, Evelyn plunged the knife into the heart of the fire once again. This time, the flames did not retreat. Instead, they fought back, roaring with an unearthly rage that shook the very earth beneath her feet. But Evelyn held fast, focusing all of her will into the act. The world trembled as she drove the knife deeper, the flames swelling and twisting in agony. But Evelyn did not stop. She could feel the ancient presence, whatever it was, raging against her, but her resolve only grew stronger. This was her fight, her choice. She had unlocked the door, yes, but she could also close it. She would not let this darkness consume everything. A blinding light erupted from the fire, and Evelyn felt herself being pulled into it, her body and mind torn between two worlds. She could hear the screams of the figures, the ancient ones, as they shrieked in fury, their forms disintegrating into nothingness. The force of the light overwhelmed her, and for a moment, she lost herself in it, her consciousness slipping away. When the light finally faded, the world around her was silent. The storm had ceased, and the fire had died. The trees stood still, no longer bending under the weight of the darkness that had once consumed them. The ground beneath her feet was solid, unyielding, and the oppressive presence that had haunted her was gone. Evelyn stood alone in the clearing, the knife still gripped tightly in her hand, her body trembling from the ordeal. The figures, Jack and the others, were gone, their twisted forms reduced to nothing more than ash. The forest, which had once seemed alive with an ancient, malevolent force, was now quiet, empty. The world felt different now, lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted. But Evelyn knew that it wasn't over. The storm might have passed, the figures might have disappeared, but the door had been opened, and something had been unleashed. Something ancient, something that could never truly be forgotten. Evelyn looked around one last time, her breath steadying as she felt the weight of the world fall on her shoulders. She had won, but at what cost? What had she truly unleashed by opening that door? What had she truly let out into the world? There was no answer, only the silence of the forest. And as she turned to leave the clearing, the shadows around her seemed to shift, watching, waiting. The silence that followed the battle was deafening. Evelyn stood in the center of the once chaotic clearing, the ground beneath her trembling only slightly now. Her body trembled as well, still holding onto the knife, knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. The air was still cold, but the intensity of the storm had disappeared, leaving nothing but the muffled sounds of snow falling lightly in the distance. The forest, which had been alive with rage and darkness moments ago, now appeared hollow, lifeless, as though it too had been drained of its very essence. Her chest heaved, though not from exertion. The fear and disbelief still clung to her like a shroud. Evelyn's mind raced, struggling to comprehend everything that had just happened. What had she done? How could a simple forest have held such dark power? And more importantly, what was that dark force she had unleashed, or rather sealed away? The knowledge sat heavily on her shoulders like an unbearable weight. Looking down at the knife, still slick with something darker than mere blood, Evelyn slowly pulled it free from her palm, the action oddly mundane. There was no sensation of pain, just an eerie numbness, like her body had shut down in the face of such overwhelming terror. The knife felt both foreign and familiar, its weight in her hand more symbolic now than ever before. It had been the key to breaking open something ancient and powerful, and it would haunt her forever. Her gaze drifted across the clearing, taking in the aftermath. The fire was gone, its once fierce flames extinguished as though they had never been there at all. The ground was charred and blackened, but even that was beginning to fade as the snow started to fall gently, as if washing away the remnants of what had occurred. The twisted figures, the grotesque entities that had surrounded the fire, had vanished without a trace, reduced to ash or something far worse. Evelyn turned slowly, her eyes scanning the forest once again, searching for something, for the last remnants of the darkness, something that might still be lingering. But there was nothing. The trees stood silent, their branches swaying slightly in the cold wind that returned, though gentler now. The eerie glow that had accompanied the storm was gone, leaving only a dim, gray haze that cast everything into an uncertain light. She took a step forward, her breath visible in the chilled air. But this time it felt different, lighter. The oppressive force that had pressed down on her chest, choking her with fear and confusion, was gone. It felt like she had severed a piece of herself, something both terrible and powerful, in that final act. Still, Evelyn felt nothing but dread. Her gaze flickered to the sky, now a dull, heavy gray. The forest stretched on endlessly, vast and desolate, but it no longer held the same claustrophobic energy. It had been subdued, silenced by something far greater than herself. A cold wind picked up again, blowing snowflakes past her, stinging her cheeks and hair. She could feel the bite of the air now, not dulled by panic or adrenaline, and yet it only added to her isolation. The sense of being utterly alone sank deeper with every passing second. Evelyn's mind reeled, unable to grasp what she had truly unleashed, or worse, what was now contained. The thought made her stomach turn. "Why me?" Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. Her words felt hollow, swallowed up by the empty expanse of the woods. The thought echoed in her mind, reverberating louder than before. She could still hear the whispering voices, faint but unmistakable, lingering somewhere deep within her thoughts. The voice that had spoken of ancient powers, of forces long forgotten. It felt as though it had burrowed deep into her mind, taking root alongside every terrifying memory of that night. As Evelyn continued to walk, her steps tentative, she felt as though something unseen was following her. Presence. Not the dark entity she had battled, but something more subtle, something patient and waiting. The forest itself felt alive again, though not with malice. It was as though it had simply returned to its original stillness, observing her every move with quiet detachment. The realization struck her. Something was still out there, something far greater and more ancient than she could ever understand. The forest had always been a gateway, and while she had tried to seal it, perhaps it wasn't something that could be so easily contained. There would always be something else lingering, something waiting. Her breathing slowed as her mind raced through every detail of what had happened. The ancient forces, the fire that had opened the door, and the power she had tapped into. It felt insurmountable, impossible to truly grasp. Evelyn's mind drifted back to the twisted figures, their monstrous forms that had once been human, and the sheer power they held. They were part of something far darker, something beyond her understanding. Her hands clenched tightly around the knife again as she continued walking, each step feeling heavier. The forest around her stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast wilderness untouched by time. There were no roads, no signs of civilization, no way out. Panic tried to rise within her, but Evelyn pushed it down. She had faced something beyond fear. What was left was numbness, a hollow void in her chest. She had sealed away something powerful, something that had been waiting, and yet it felt far from over. The forest had allowed her to believe she had won, but it was merely toying with her. Her mind drifted to Jack, the man she had once known. Jack Turner had been consumed by something far darker, his form twisted and broken in ways no human could survive. The memory of his eyes, those hollow, black voids, haunted her, seared into her mind. How had someone she knew become something so monstrous? The answer, she realized, was far too terrible to bear. Jack had been part of this, part of something ancient, something bound long ago. And now so was she. Evelyn's heart sank as the weight of what she had done began to settle. She could never return home. Not after this. There would be no returning to the life she once knew, to the simple cabin and the quiet solace of the forest. The woods had claimed her now, in ways she could never escape. Her gaze darted around one last time, scanning the emptiness that stretched before her. No sound but the gentle whisper of the wind through the trees. No life but the eerie stillness. Yet, Evelyn felt something deeper, a presence beneath it all. The forest itself had become her prison, her eternal reminder of the night she had broken something far beyond her control. What she had sealed away may yet return. The fire that she had tried to put out was only dormant, waiting for another opportunity, for another way in. And Evelyn knew deep down, she could never stop it. As the weight of this reality bore down on her, Evelyn's steps faltered. She sank slowly to her knees, the knife slipping from her hand as she collapsed into the snow, the full force of what she had done breaking her. There was no escape, and the forest, it waited. The snow continued to fall gently around Evelyn as she knelt in the clearing, the cold air biting at her skin. The world around her was vast, silent, but in the depth of that silence, she could feel the weight of her actions. The forest had grown still, but it wasn't peaceful. There was an ever-present hum in the air, as if the ground itself was vibrating with the energy of something ancient, something that had not been entirely subdued. Evelyn's mind raced with thoughts that spiraled into confusion and dread. Her hands were trembling. Her body was worn out, but her mind could not rest. She had sealed something away. Yes, but what had she really done? It felt like there was no resolution, no clear end to the horror that had unfurled in those moments. The figures, the twisted beings that had once been friends and neighbors, had vanished into the nothingness of the forest. But Evelyn knew they were still out there. There was always a price to pay for tapping into such primal forces. She could feel it now, deep in her bones. She stood shakily, her legs weak beneath her, and slowly bent to retrieve the knife from the ground, its hilt slick with blood that no longer seemed to matter. The knife had been her tool, her salvation in that moment of terror, but now it seemed like nothing more than a weight that she was burdened with. She glanced at the blade, its reflection in the pale snow, and in that split second, the memories flooded her again. Jack, his twisted form, the monstrous faces, the fire, and the ancient power that had reached through the veil and consumed everything. Her heart skipped a beat. Was it over? Was it really over? The air felt heavy again, more oppressive than before. She could feel it around her, like an invisible hand gripping her throat. She looked up at the dark sky, her eyes narrowing as the wind began to pick up once more. The forest had gone quiet, but it was a silence that carried a threat, a warning that she couldn't ignore. Something was watching her. Evelyn felt it in the pit of her stomach, a sensation she couldn't shake. She turned and began walking, slowly at first, as though testing the ground beneath her feet. The path ahead was unclear, winding and treacherous, the trees towering over her like silent sentinels. The forest seemed endless, stretching out in every direction. The same barren, haunting landscape that had been her prison for so long. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she moved forward, the silence of the woods now deafening in its own way. Evelyn's thoughts kept returning to the figures, those twisted souls, her friends, her neighbors. What had happened to them? Were they gone for good, or had they simply been absorbed into the very thing they had become part of? She remembered their faces, their eyes dark and hollow, their bodies stretching and warping in grotesque fashion. The sound of their whispers still lingered in her ears, a haunting reminder of the ritual they had enacted. The words they spoke, the power they had awakened, were beyond her understanding. The ancient force they had summoned, the thing that had answered their call, was still a mystery, its true nature unknown. She shuddered, but the cold wind cut through her like a blade. Her breath came in short bursts, visible in the icy air. Her feet dragged through the snow, each step a reminder of how far she had gone, how much she had left behind. As she walked, Evelyn began to notice subtle changes in the forest. The trees seemed to have grown thicker, their trunks larger, their branches twisting in unnatural shapes. The once serene landscape now felt ominous, as if it were closing in on her, suffocating her with its heavy presence. The snow continued to fall, but it felt like it was coming from all directions, swirling in the air around her, catching in her hair, on her face, until it seemed as though the forest itself was trying to obscure her path, to trap her. The sound of something shifting in the distance caught her attention. She froze, listening intently. There was no sign of movement, no animals, no birds, but the rustling was there, faint but unmistakable. The forest had always been silent, but now the quiet was disturbed. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the snow, it was something else. A low whisper reached her ears, and though the words were incomprehensible, she recognized the sound. It was the same voice, the ancient voice that had spoken to her from the fire, the voice that had warned her of the consequences of her actions. It was back. Evelyn, the voice whispered, soft and insidious, curling around her name like smoke. You cannot escape. Her heart pounded in her chest as the voice seemed to grow louder, as though it was coming from all around her. The trees creaked in response, bending and shifting in unnatural ways, as though they were alive, responding to the presence that had once been unleashed. The air around her thickened, growing heavier, and she could feel the force pressing in, like a tightening grip around her throat. Where do you think you can run? The voice continued, its tone becoming sharper, more menacing. There is nowhere left for you. Evelyn's pulse quickened as her breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced. What did it mean? Was it referring to the forest? Was the forest now a prison, bound to her in some way? She couldn't escape. Not from the forest, and not from the forces she had unleashed. Turning, Evelyn began to walk faster, the crunch of snow beneath her boots growing louder with each hurried step. She needed to find a way out. She needed to find something, anything, to end this nightmare. But the further she walked, the more the landscape began to shift. The trees twisted, their branches now twisted into grotesque, claw-like shapes. The snow was falling faster now, coming down in thick sheets that obscured her vision. She felt the chill deepen, a biting cold that seeped into her very bones, numbing her body from the inside out. Her mind was foggy, a sense of confusion clouding her every thought. It was as if the forest itself was becoming disorienting, bending reality to its will. She stumbled forward, her movements becoming sluggish. The world around her seemed to blur, fading in and out like a dream. The trees that had once towered over her now seemed to loom, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to follow her every movement. And then, in the distance, something caught her eye. A figure. At first, Evelyn thought it was a trick of the light, a mirage conjured by the shifting snow. But as she moved closer, the figure became clearer. It was a man, his face obscured by shadows, standing in the middle of the path ahead of her. Her heart skipped a beat. The figure was familiar, too familiar. It was Jack. No, it couldn't be. Jack was gone. He had been consumed by whatever dark force had taken hold of the forest. Yet here he was, standing in front of her, his body still, his eyes black as night, just like they had been when he had become one of them. Jack, Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it simply stood there, unmoving, its form twisted and deformed, as though it was both human and something far darker. The shadows around him seemed to stretch, growing longer, reaching for her. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat, and before she could move, the figure raised its arm, pointing toward her. The whispering started again, rising in volume, growing more insistent, more frantic. It was everywhere now, inside her mind, inside her bones, inside her very soul. It was as if the voice was consuming her, trying to pull her into the depths of its power. "You are not free, Evelyn," the voice crooned. "You are ours now." Evelyn's knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to the ground, overwhelmed by the power that pressed down on her from all sides. The snow continued to fall, and the forest continued to watch in eerie silence, as though it were waiting for the next part of the story to unfold. There was no escape. She was trapped, forever. But even as her vision began to fade, a strange thought flickered in the back of her mind. Could she still fight? Could she still close the door that she had opened, no matter how long it had been since she had unleashed it? The question lingered in the freezing air, unanswered, as the darkness closed in around her. As Evelyn lay in the snow, her breath shallow and her body numb, the weight of everything she had experienced seemed to bear down on her all at once. The figure of Jack, or what had once been Jack, stood motionless in front of her, its form shifting in and out of focus, a twisted mockery of the man she had once known. The shadows that clung to it felt alive, writhing and swirling around its figure, creeping toward her like tendrils of an ancient, malevolent force. Her heart pounded in her chest, every beat echoing in the silence of the forest. The whispers in her mind grew louder, the voices stretching into a cacophony of sound that rattled her bones. The force that had been unleashed that night, the one she had tried so desperately to contain, was still out there, still reaching for her, still claiming her as its own. She tried to move, to rise from the snow, but her body felt like lead. Her limbs refused to obey her, and every inch of her skin seemed to burn with the cold that had seeped deep inside her. The knife lay discarded on the ground beside her, its gleaming edge still stained with the remnants of blood, the very same blood that had been spilled in the ritual she had witnessed. The blade had been her only means of defense, her only connection to the power she had tapped into, but it now seemed like a hollow reminder of everything she had failed to stop. Jack's figure shifted slightly, and she could feel its gaze on her. It was as though the twisted thing before her was aware of her every thought, every fear. It was in her head now, clawing at the edges of her consciousness, whispering things she couldn't understand. Its presence was suffocating, and the very air around her seemed to crackle with the energy it radiated. "Evelyn," the voice whispered again, this time closer, almost as if it were speaking directly into her ear. The sound of it made her skin crawl. "You cannot escape. You cannot undo what has been done." The words hung in the air, thick with menace. There was no argument, no reasoning. This was the truth, the undeniable reality of what she had become a part of. Evelyn had thought that by killing the twisted entities, by ending the ritual, she could rid herself of the curse, but it had never been that simple. The power she had meddled with was ancient, older than the forest itself, and it would not be so easily denied. It had found a way into her life, into her soul, and now it wanted its due. The forest around her seemed to respond, as though the trees themselves were closing in, pressing in from all sides. The shadows grew longer, darker, and the wind began to howl through the trees, carrying with it the sound of distant voices, too many voices. They seemed to echo off the snow-covered ground, rising up from the very earth itself. The voices of those who had been consumed before her, the souls who had been twisted into something unrecognizable, something dark. Evelyn's mind reeled as she tried to focus, to make sense of it all. She had always known the forest held secrets, ancient ones, but she had never understood the depth of those secrets until now. What had she truly unleashed? What had she become a part of? She had thought that by defeating the figures, by destroying the rituals, she could put an end to it all. But in her ignorance, she had only made things worse. The shadow of Jack loomed closer, his eyes now gleaming with the same dark, hollow voids that had consumed him. He reached out a hand toward her, and in that moment, Evelyn felt a jolt of terror like she had never known. The air seemed to crackle with static, as if the very fabric of reality was beginning to unravel, the line between the living and the dead blurring. She tried to push herself up again, but her body felt weak and unresponsive. It was as if the darkness had a hold of her, its grip tightening with each passing moment. "Jack," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Is it really you? Or are you just—" Her words trailed off as she looked into the endless darkness of his eyes. There was no recognition there, no warmth, no humanity. He was gone. This thing before her was not Jack. It was something else, something that had taken his place, something that had taken his soul. The figure, Jack, moved closer still, its hand reaching for her with an unnatural slowness, as though it was savoring the moment. Evelyn's chest tightened as the weight of her situation pressed in on her, suffocating her. The forest, the trees, the snow, the voices, all of it was closing in, smothering her in the darkness that had been awakened. The whispers grew louder, as though the forest itself were speaking through them. The ancient presence that had taken root in the woods was speaking to her now, its words laced with venom. She could feel the malice, the resentment that had been buried here for so long, reaching out to claim her. "You are a part of this now," the voice rasped. "No one leaves once they've tasted the power." Evelyn's mind reeled, her thoughts spinning out of control. She tried to push herself up again, but the figure before her stopped her with a single, icy touch. The cold radiated from its fingers, and for a moment, she felt as if her very soul was being frozen in place. Every part of her wanted to scream, to fight back, but her body refused to respond. It was as if the very essence of her had been drained away, leaving only the hollow shell of a woman who had once known fear. "You belong to the woods now," the voice whispered once more, its tone softer, almost triumphant. "And the woods will never let you go." Evelyn's eyes went wide, her heart hammering in her chest as she realized the truth of those words. She had been trapped, not by the forest itself, but by the power she had called into being. The forest had always been a living entity, something ancient and unknowable. And now, she had become a part of its eternal curse, a piece of something much larger, much older than herself. But there had to be something she could do. She couldn't just give up. The fight had never been about survival. It had always been about resisting, about trying to undo the horrors she had unwittingly unleashed. Evelyn had witnessed the horrors before her. She had witnessed the transformations, the madness that overtook the people she had once known. They had become instruments of this force, enslaved by the very power she had awakened. She could feel that same temptation pulling at her now, urging her to give in, to let the power consume her and free her from the struggle. But deep down, Evelyn knew that if she gave in, if she accepted this darkness, there would be no turning back. There would be no escape. Her eyes scanned the figure of Jack. No, whatever it was now, and then she turned her gaze to the dark forest behind him. The trees, once familiar and comforting, now loomed like silent sentinels. Their shadows stretched long and twisted. The snow continued to fall, but it no longer felt like it was cleansing the air. It felt like it was suffocating her, drowning her in an icy grip that she couldn't escape. The whispers grew louder, and Evelyn could feel them inside her head now, scratching and clawing at her thoughts. But something within her stirred, something deep down in the pit of her stomach. She was tired. She was weak, but she refused to let this be the end. Not yet. With what little strength she had left, Evelyn pushed herself up, ignoring the biting cold that gripped her, ignoring the pain that seared through her limbs. Her hand found the knife, and she gripped it with the last remnants of her strength, the blade cold and heavy in her hand. The figure of Jack, the twisted thing, moved toward her, its form blurring and shifting. The dark presence was closing in, but Evelyn refused to let it consume her. Not like this, not now. With a scream that reverberated through the forest, Evelyn surged forward, her body moving on pure instinct. She didn't know if she could fight this darkness, but she knew she had to try. She had to survive. She had to resist. But as the knife gleamed in the dim light, something deep within her knew that no matter how hard she fought, she would never truly escape the forest. It would always be waiting for her. Evelyn's heart pounded wildly in her chest as she lifted the knife, its weight suddenly more daunting than ever before. The cold metal felt heavy in her trembling hand, almost as if it were urging her to turn back, to let go and accept the fate that was being forced upon her. But in the deepest recesses of her soul, a flicker of defiance burned. She couldn't give in. Not yet. The figure before her, what remained of Jack, didn't move, its eyes glowing with an eerie light, fixed upon her. It stood as a twisted reflection of the man she had once known. His face was gaunt, his features warped, the edges of his body distorting in unnatural angles. The once familiar warmth in his eyes was now replaced by a hollow void, empty and consuming, just like the forest itself. The wind had begun to howl around her, sending icy tendrils of snow whipping through the air. The trees, once towering and majestic, now seemed like twisted, gnarled hands reaching down from above, their skeletal branches clawing at the darkened sky. The snow had turned from a gentle fall to a blinding, oppressive storm. Each snowflake felt like a sharp needle against her skin, and each gust of wind carried with it the whispers of the forest, the voices of those who had been lost, consumed by the power that had taken root here. Her grip tightened around the knife. The whispers weren't just coming from the wind anymore. They were inside her mind, threading through her thoughts like threads of silk. The voices spoke in unison, a chorus of desperation, madness, and longing. Their words were almost incomprehensible, but one thing was clear. They wanted her to join them. They wanted her to give in to the darkness, to become one with the forest. "You cannot fight it, Evelyn," the voice of Jack rasped, though the words seemed to come not from his mouth, but from the very air itself. "You belong here just like the rest of us. You've already crossed the line. You're one of us now." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the truth of his words deep inside her. The ritual had been far more than she had understood at the time. The ancient power that the forest held had already seeped into her, had already begun to twist her soul. She could feel the pull, the desire to succumb, to let the darkness fill the void inside her and wash away the pain. It would be so easy, too easy to give in. But she couldn't. Not after everything she had seen. Not after the friends she had lost, the people who had been consumed by this force. She couldn't be the next soul to fall into the forest's grasp. Not like this. The knife's blade gleamed in the darkness, and Evelyn took a deep breath. She could feel the power inside her, the dark force that had been awakened, and she knew it wasn't entirely gone. She had only sealed it away for a time, but it was still there, still clawing at her insides, begging to be released. The forest itself seemed to vibrate with the energy of that power. The trees creaked and groaned, the ground shifting beneath her feet. The air was thick with tension, and she could feel the oppressive weight of it pushing down on her. "You can't escape us, Evelyn," Jack's voice repeated, his eyes now glowing with an unnatural light. "You are ours. We are the forest. You will never leave." Her pulse quickened, her fingers trembling around the hilt of the knife. She had to resist. She had to break free. Without warning, the figure of Jack lunged forward, his movements unnatural and jerky, like a puppet with its strings pulled too tight. The force of his attack sent Evelyn sprawling backward, the snow beneath her giving way like soft sand. She gasped, her breath coming in shallow bursts as she struggled to regain her footing. But Jack wasn't alone. As she tried to scramble to her feet, shadows began to move around her, thick, oppressive shadows that rose from the very earth, from the ground beneath her feet. They coiled and shifted, forming vague shapes that seemed to flicker and pulse with an almost tangible energy. They were everywhere now, around her, closing in, surrounding her with an almost suffocating presence. Her mind raced as she clutched the knife with both hands, trying to steady herself, trying to find some semblance of control in the chaos. The shadows were creeping closer, their cold, dark forms slipping through the snow like liquid darkness. The whispers grew louder, their voices blending into a maddening hum, their words overlapping and distorted. "Join us," they hissed in unison. "Become one with the forest. It is your destiny." The figure of Jack was still moving toward her, his body shifting and warping, the shadows of the forest clinging to him like a second skin. His mouth opened, but instead of words, a low, guttural growl emerged from deep within his throat. A sound that was not human, not even close. The air around him crackled with dark energy, the very atmosphere warping in response to his presence. Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest. She couldn't think. She couldn't focus. The weight of everything, the ritual, the power, the horrors of the forest, was pressing down on her like an iron vice. The shadows were closing in, and the figure of Jack was moving faster now, his movements jerky and unnatural, but powerful nonetheless. Evelyn's breath hitched as she saw the shadows reaching for her, their fingers stretching out, their tendrils lashing out with an almost predatory hunger. The knife felt like an anchor in her hand, too heavy, too slow, but it was all she had, all she could rely on. With a sharp cry, she swung the blade at the shadows, the cold steel cutting through the air. For a moment, it felt like she had struck something, like the knife had connected with the darkness. The shadows hissed, recoiling, but they quickly regathered, their forms twisting and reforming, always returning. It was as if nothing could touch them, nothing could break through the suffocating grip they had on her. But Evelyn didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She swung again, and again, her movements growing more frantic, more desperate. She had to find a way out. She had to find a way to fight back. And then, as if by instinct, she did. The knife cleaved through the air once more. But this time, it felt different. This time, it felt like something had shifted. The shadows recoiled, as though the very presence of the blade was pushing them back. A surge of energy pulsed through Evelyn, coursing through her veins like fire. It was the same energy, the same dark force, but it was hers now. She had taken it. She had claimed it. For the first time since the ritual had begun, Evelyn felt a flicker of control. The shadows wavered, their shapes distorting and flickering as if they were uncertain, confused by the surge of power that had erupted from within her. She lifted the knife higher, her grip steady, and the darkness shrank back, retreating into the depths of the forest. Jack's figure hesitated, as though caught between two worlds, one that was pulling him toward the forest, and one that was pulling him away from it. The air around him shimmered, like a veil was being drawn over him, blocking him from her vision. "You cannot control this power," Jack's voice rasped. "No longer human, no longer Jack. You will fail, just like the others." But Evelyn wasn't listening anymore. She had found her strength. She had found the will to fight. She raised the knife high, and with one final, desperate cry, she plunged it into the ground, driving it deep into the earth. The impact sent a shock wave of energy pulsing through the forest, rippling outward like a wave, shaking the very foundation of the woods. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into smoke as they were ripped away, their presence fading into nothingness. The wind howled, and for a moment, Evelyn felt as though she were being pulled apart. But she held on. When the storm cleared, when the voices fell silent, she stood alone in the snow. The forest was still, the once oppressive weight now lifted. The figure of Jack was gone, along with the shadows, the whispers, and the terrible energy that had bound them together. But as Evelyn stood there, breathing heavily, she knew that this was not the end. The forest had been defeated, yes, but it would never truly be gone. It was always watching, always waiting for the next soul to wander too deep. And somewhere, deep in the woods, the ancient power still slumbered, waiting for the next call. Evelyn would always remember that. She would never forget the feeling of the forest closing in, of the power that had threatened to consume her. It was a part of her now as much as the knife was, as much as the snow and the trees were. And no matter where she went, she knew she would always carry the forest with her. Evelyn stood motionless, her breath ragged, her pulse still echoing in her ears as the once menacing forest around her began to settle. The wind had died down, the heavy snowfall now reduced to a light dusting that blanketed the ground in silence. It was an eerie calm that hung in the air, like the stillness after a storm, and for a brief moment, Evelyn almost convinced herself that the nightmare was over. But she knew better. The power she had unleashed, the dark energy that had taken root deep within the forest, was still there, lingering like a shadow on the edge of her consciousness. Though the immediate threat had been vanquished, she knew the forest had not forgiven her. No, it had merely bided its time, allowing her a brief reprieve before it would come for her once more. With a heavy heart, Evelyn turned away from the spot where she had plunged the knife into the earth. The snow beneath her boots crunched with each step, but the sound was strangely hollow, as though the forest had swallowed all other noises. Her hands still gripped the hilt of the knife, its cold steel now comforting in its familiar weight. The blade was her only connection to the world she had once known, the only thing keeping her grounded in reality. As she walked through the woods, she couldn't shake the feeling that the trees were watching her. Their gnarled branches stretched upward like twisted hands, their dark silhouettes standing in stark contrast against the pale sky. The snow-covered ground felt like a graveyard, each footstep a reminder of all that had been lost. The trees seemed to loom closer, their shadows creeping forward as if eager to reclaim her. Evelyn pushed the thoughts aside. She couldn't afford to let herself slip into despair. Not yet. She had survived so far. She would continue to survive. She had no choice. The path ahead of her seemed endless, winding through the dense woods that seemed to close in on her with each passing moment. There was no sign of civilization, no roads, no houses, no lights in the distance. She was alone in the wilderness, and the silence of the forest was suffocating. For the first time, Evelyn truly understood the isolation that came with being lost. She had been lost in this forest, physically and mentally, ever since the ritual had first begun. The memories of that night still haunted her, vivid, unrelenting. She had seen the forest in its full, horrifying glory, the way it bled darkness and twisted those it consumed into something else. The people she had known, her friends, her family, turned into instruments of the forest's will. She had watched as they became part of something greater, something ancient and malevolent. Their faces had contorted into grotesque masks, their bodies reshaping into beings that were no longer human. And she had been powerless to stop it. But she had fought. She had fought with everything she had. She had fought to survive, to free herself from the dark grip of the forest. And in the end, she had succeeded, at least for now. But the cost had been high. Her heart ached as she thought of Jack, the man she had once loved. His face had been the first to change, his eyes the first to grow hollow, his smile the first to become a twisted mockery of the person she had known. She had been forced to kill him, to end his suffering, and it had broken her. The guilt gnawed at her, eating away at her from the inside. Could she have saved him? Could she have stopped the ritual before it had gone too far? The thought that maybe she could have prevented it all clawed at her mind, but she pushed it away. There was no point in dwelling on the past. What was done was done. What mattered now was the future, her future, but that future felt uncertain. The forest still had its hooks in her. No matter how far she walked, no matter how fast she ran, it was always there, lurking in the back of her mind, in the creaking of the trees, in the whispering winds that tugged at her consciousness. She could feel it, a constant presence that never truly left her. She had to find a way out. But how? She had tried everything she could think of. She had fought the dark forces of the forest with the knife, with the strength of will she had left, and yet here she was, still wandering, still lost. The forest would not let her go. Her breath came faster as the realization settled in. There was no escaping it. The forest was part of her now, just as it had been part of Jack, part of everyone who had been consumed before her. The curse was not something she could outrun. It was something that would follow her, always. Evelyn shook her head violently, as if trying to shake the thought from her mind. She couldn't think like that. She wouldn't think like that. She had to keep moving. She had to keep going. She pressed forward, her steps heavy in the snow. The forest was growing denser, the trees more twisted, their trunks gnarled and bent like the limbs of some ancient creature. The ground beneath her feet was soft and uneven, making each step a struggle. The wind picked up again, this time stronger, as if the forest itself were urging her onward, pushing her deeper into its heart. For hours she walked, the world around her becoming a blur of white and gray. The trees stretched higher and higher, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the sun. The light seemed to fade, the sky turning a dull, oppressive shade of gray that felt heavy, like the weight of the world was pressing down on her. The snow continued to fall, thick and fast, creating a surreal, dreamlike landscape that seemed to stretch on forever. Evelyn's legs were aching, her feet numb, but she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. The only thing that kept her going was the faint hope that somewhere in this endless expanse of snow and trees, there was an escape. There had to be. And then, just when she thought she couldn't take another step, she saw it. In the distance, through the snow, a flicker of light. At first, it was just a faint glow, barely visible through the veil of the storm, but it grew stronger, brighter, until she could see it clearly. A cabin. A small, humble structure, nestled among the trees, its windows glowing warmly in the midst of the storm. Evelyn's heart leaped in her chest. She stumbled toward it, her feet dragging through the snow, her mind racing. Could it be real? Was it a mirage? Or had the forest, in some twisted way, drawn her here? She didn't care. She didn't question it. She was going to make it to that cabin, even if it meant crawling the last few steps. As she neared the cabin, she could see the smoke rising from the chimney, curling into the sky in soft tendrils. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, she could hear the faint sound of crackling wood. Without thinking, Evelyn pushed the door open, her fingers numb from the cold, and stepped inside. The warmth hit her like a wave. It was a stark contrast to the biting cold outside, and for a moment, she closed her eyes, allowing herself to bask in the heat. The cabin was simple, rustic, but comfortable. A fire burned in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The room was furnished with a few chairs, a table, and shelves lined with old books and trinkets. She took a step inside, closing the door behind her. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she finally allowed herself a moment to rest. She leaned against the door, her eyes closed, letting the warmth seep into her bones. But as the minutes passed, she began to feel something strange. The air in the cabin was too still, too quiet. She could hear the fire crackling, but the silence was unnerving. Felt wrong. Evelyn opened her eyes and looked around, scanning the room. There was no one there, no sign of life. Yet the unease grew, gnawing at her as she walked deeper into the cabin. And then, as her gaze fell upon a small, weathered mirror hanging on the wall, she froze. In the reflection, she saw herself. But there was something different about her. Her face, once pale with exhaustion, was now flushed with color. Her eyes, once dull and tired, now gleamed with an unnatural light. And behind her, barely visible, was a figure, a shadow, standing in the doorway. The figure was tall, its form dark and indistinct, like a silhouette against the dim light. And though she couldn't see its face, she knew deep down who it was. Jack. No, it couldn't be him. But as she turned slowly, her heart hammering in her chest, the door slammed shut behind her. The room grew colder, the air thick with the scent of earth and decay. The fire sputtered, its flames flickering and dimming, as though something was smothering it. Evelyn spun around, her breath catching in her throat, but the figure was gone. The mirror showed only the empty room. And then, a voice. "You can never escape." Evelyn's heart stopped as the words echoed through her mind. Evelyn stood frozen in the center of the cabin, the world around her swirling in an unsettling haze. The warmth of the fire, the once comforting presence, now felt alien, oppressive. Her breath trembled in her chest, the lingering whispers in her mind growing louder with each passing second. The shadow in the mirror, the voice that had haunted her, was not just a figment of her imagination. It was real, and it was always there, lurking just beyond her reach. She backed away from the mirror, her heart pounding in her chest as the cabin's silence closed in around her. The walls seemed to stretch and groan, the shadows flickering and shifting in unnatural patterns. It wasn't the first time the forest had tricked her, but this time it felt different. This time it was personal. The cabin had never been a safe haven. It had never been a place of comfort. It was a trap, a manifestation of the forest's power, a place where the line between reality and nightmare had blurred beyond recognition. The forest had not let her go. No, it had only allowed her to think she had escaped. As the shadows began to close in again, Evelyn made her choice. She knew there was no escaping the forest. There was no escaping what she had become, what she had done. But she had a choice now, a choice to face it, to confront the darkness, and to fight until her last breath. With a deep breath, Evelyn stepped forward, the knife still clutched tightly in her hand. She would not run. She would not give in. She had survived the horrors of the woods once before, and she would do it again. As she prepared to face whatever came next, the forest outside seemed to stir, its whispers growing louder, but Evelyn stood tall. The journey had been long, and the road ahead uncertain. But one thing was clear. She would face the forest on her terms. She would no longer be its victim. And so, in the quiet darkness of the cabin, Evelyn's story came to an end. The forest would never truly let her go, but she had found the strength to stand against it, to reclaim a part of herself that had been lost long ago. To the listeners who have followed her journey, I extend my deepest thanks. You have walked with her through the terror, through the cold and the silence, and I hope you found the courage to face your own fears, as she did. Now, as the night deepens and the world outside fades into quiet, I wish you peaceful rest. Close your eyes, drift into sleep, and may your dreams be full of light and warmth. Good night and sweet dreams.